said that Jonathan Edwards, the third president of Princeton and the famous American preacher, had a daughter with an uncontrollable temper. And as often is the case, the outside world didn't know about it. So a young man fell in love with his daughter and sought her hand in marriage, and he responded by saying, "You can't have her. But I love her. You can't have her. But she loves me. You can't have her." So the young man, frustrated, said, "Why?" "Because she's not worthy of you." "But she is a Christian, is she not?" And I love his response. He said, "Yes, she is a Christian, but the grace of God can live with some people in whom no one else can ever live." I think Paul's message today is to try to keep us from that, to try to keep us from not being the type of people where the grace of God is the only place they can live. Nobody else can live with them. So in Colossians, what we've been going through the past several weeks, chapters 1 and 2, what Paul's doing is he's setting his theology. He's setting his foundation. And much like Paul's other letters, he would begin with his theology, his foundation, and then he would move into application. Now, what do we do with this? And that's what we've been looking at for the past couple of weeks, Paul's theology. And to be honest with you, it was a little deeper, it was a little harder than I was expecting, and I'm sure it was kind of hard to listen to as well. It was deep, it was difficult. And then now in chapter 3, we move on from his theology into his application. And one of the first things that he tells them to do is to put off this old life. Put it off. In verse 1, he says, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things that are above and not on the things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you: sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these you too once walked when you were living in them, but now you must put them away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its Creator. Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all." So the first thing that he tells them to do is to put off the old life. Actually, he tells them a little bit more graphic. He says, put it to death. Do away with it. It's been crucified with Christ. You have died with him. So put it to death. Put it behind you. Put it away from you. This is not who you are anymore. And he gives them two lists. We have a list in verse 5 and a list in verse 8. He says in verse 5, sexual immorality, impurity, passions, evil desires, covetousness, which is idolatry. In verse 8, he says anger, wrath, malice, slander, obscene talk from your mouth. The problem that oftentimes we face is we emphasize one list, but we neglect the other list. Oftentimes we look at one and say that's a lot worse than the other, so we're focused on that one, but really anger and wrath and crude joke, really that's not too bad. So we look at one and we say that's evil. Anybody who does that is evil, but then we downplay the other list as well. It's okay. It's fine. it's really not that bad. But there's a reason that Paul tells us that we're to put it to death, that we're to put it away. Because both of the lists ultimately will lead to death. It will lead to destruction. Anger will destroy us. Malice and slander will destroy us, as much as impurities and passions and evil desires will destroy us. And Paul talks about how the wrath of God is coming for these things. Now, I want us to understand, when Paul's talking about the wrath of God is coming for these things, he's not saying that God is just a God that's full of anger, that delights in smiting people, and he just finds joy in destruction. No. The wrath of God is coming because God is a God of love. God is a God of justice. And God has seen what sin has done to the world. I told Sunday school class last week or a couple of weeks ago that I wouldn't be a very good father if someone hurt Grace and I just said, well, that's fine. Let's not worry about it. I wouldn't be a very good father if somebody hurt her, caused her scars, and wouldn't seek justice. I love her, and I would want justice. The problem is, I would have to keep myself from doing the justice myself, but I wouldn't be a very good father. I wouldn't love her as much. And I think when we look at the wrath of God, we have to keep that in mind. The wrath of God is coming because God is a God of love. He's brokenhearted to see what sin has done to his creation. To see what sin has done to you. How it's hurt you. How it's scarred you. God can't overlook it. God can't just forgive, and in the end, love wins. He wouldn't be a very good God if he did. He wouldn't be a God of justice. He wouldn't be a God of love. The wrath of God is coming because God is a God of love. But Paul also reminds them, so that they can't become arrogant, that they used to walk in this. Both of these lists, they used to walk in it. They used to live in it. So he hits it twice. He tells them you used to walk in this when you were living in these things. Walk would refer to more of your conduct. What you do, how you live. The fact that he goes on and says when you were living in them tells them that they were a little bit more settled down. This isn't just what they do. This isn't just a conduct that they have on occasion. This is who they are. They have settled in. This is who they have become. They've become people who are filled with wrath and anger and malice and slander. This is who they were. It's not who they are now, but he reminds them of who they were. And in verse 10, he reminds them of why. It says, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. So why are we to put this to death? Why are we to put this behind us? The why is twofold here. The why is, one, we have put it to death with Christ. We have crucified it with him. And in baptism, we have participated in his death so that we will participate in his resurrection. We have put it behind us. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. But the other reason is the renewal of our mind. The image of the Creator. You see, Paul understood that what we think ultimately determines what we do. How we think, what we think on, our reactions, determines what we do. We need to renew that. We need to change our thought pattern, change how we think, because if we change how we think, that will change how we act. We need to be reminded that we have put that behind us. that is no longer who we are. So Paul transitions. He transitions from the negative, put this off, to more of a positive, put this on. It's as if we walked through the fog and now we have hit sunshine. And the motivation is the same. The reason we're to put this off is because it's been crucified with Christ and is no longer who we are. Why we're supposed to put this on is because we've been crucified to Christ and we no longer live in those manners again. The motivation is the same. And Paul tells us that we are to put on love. In verse 12, he says, put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another. And if one has complaint against another, forgive each other, as the Lord has forgiven you. So you also must forgive. Above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of God, or Christ, rule in your heart, to which indeed you are called in one body. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing songs and hymns and spiritual songs with thanksgiving in your hearts to God. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. Paul tells us we're to put on love. Love binds all of these together. We're to put on love by remembering who we are. He tells them, put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy as love. He's reminding them who they are. Who they are now in Christ. They are God's chosen ones. The ones that's been chosen to be God's representatives to the world. To be the light. To be the salt. To show people Jesus' love and compassion. They are holy. They are set apart for a purpose, for a mission. And they're loved. They're loved by the Father. They're to put this off and put this on by remembering who they are. But also by bearing with one another. Paul before gave two lists. Two things that we should avoid. And now he gives us what I'll call a good list. Of compassionate heart, of kindness, humility, meekness, patience. Compassionate heart, what it means is a deep sensitivity to the needs and sorrows of others. You care about it. You care about their needs. You care about their hurts. You have compassion on them.
How does this one go?
The very first sermon that I preached here, not the trial sermon, but the very first sermon that I preached as your minister, we looked at the fact that we're all created in the image of God. Every one of us, Christian or non-Christian, we're all made in the image of God. And because we're made in the image of God, we all have inherent value. Because we have inherent value, all of us, we should care for others. Seeing the hurt, seeing the brokenness, helping the least of these. Our hearts should break with the things that breaks the heart of God. In kindness, Lord help show, defines kindness as the art of being a deer. Now, not the deer that you'd hit on the road, the other deer. The art of being a deer. Being kind. Gentle. It's a Christ-like attitude that we would have toward others. And if kindness is a Christ-like attitude that we would have toward others, humility is a Christ-like attitude that we would have for ourselves. And humility is hard to define. But I define humility as having a proper perspective of oneself. You don't think too highly of yourself, but you don't think too lowly of yourself either. You remember who you are. You are chosen. You are loved. You are God's masterpiece. We remember who we are. It wouldn't be arrogant for me to say that I believe that God has gifted me with the ability of teaching and preaching. I know it has to be a gift from Him because it absolutely terrifies me. I could not do it on my own. That's not arrogance. That's proper perspective of who I am. To say otherwise would to downplay the gift that God has given me. To be arrogant would say, I'm a good preacher because of my ability, my education, my experience. Because that's not a proper perspective. That's not where my strength comes from. That's not where my ability comes from. It doesn't come from within. Humility, having a proper perspective of who you are. But humility is also having a willingness to serve. We see Christ as the perfect example in Philippians chapter 2. That He did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but He emptied Himself, becoming a servant. And He humbled Himself, even to the point of death. Death on the cross. Humility is a willingness to serve. It's not thinking that I'm too good. I'm better than that, so I shouldn't serve. I shouldn't get down and dirty. But Jesus didn't count equality with God something to be grasped. If anybody could say, I'm too good for that, I should be worshipped, it could be Him. Rightfully so, because He's God. But He emptied Himself. And He set us the example of what it looks like to serve. What it looks like to be humble. Paul tells us also you should have meekness. Meekness is another one of those words that's very hard to define, to understand what it means. Meekness really has kind of a bad thought to it. The humorist, J. Upson Dickinson, said he was writing a book titled Cowardly Power, and that he had also founded a group of submissive people that he called doormats. Dependent organization of really meek and timid souls, if there is no other. He said their motto is this: the meek shall inherit the earth, if that's okay with everybody else. Their symbol was a yellow traffic light. You know, that's the idea oftentimes that we have of meekness. It's being a doormat. Letting people run all over you. But that's not what meekness truly is. Meekness has this idea of power under control. It's got this image of the bit that's in the mouth of a horse. That the horse, it has this power, this strength, but it's under control. Jesus was a meek man. But I don't think anyone would say Jesus was a doormat. You can't really call somebody a doormat who would go away, create a whip, come back, run everybody out of the temple, flipping the tables over. That's not a doormat. But yet he was meek. He had the power under control. Meekness is one's approach to others. How we approach others. How do we deal with others? With humility, kindness, and compassionate heart. If meekness is one's approach to others, then patience is one's reaction to others. And I don't have to tell you, we need more patience in this world. We need to change how we react to others. Just watch the news. Just read Facebook. Our reaction to other people is not very good. Paul calls us to have patience, long suffering. We suffer long with people. We have patience with them. We react differently than what our nature may want us to. And Paul says, bearing with one another. I love that he uses it this way, bearing with one another. He wouldn't tell you that you would have to bear with one another if it's really easy to really deal with each other. If the relationship and everything was perfectly fine, he wouldn't tell us that we had to bear with one another. But let's be honest, it's not. It's hard. It's difficult. Oftentimes, I don't know what people expect from the church. I guess perfection, because we mess up, though. Sometimes we may say something that we shouldn't have said, do something that we shouldn't have done. We may hurt you, and not on purpose, I promise. At least not for me. I promise. We care. But we're to bear with one another. If there is a complaint, I love how he says that. If anyone has a complaint, it's a church. We don't have any complaints here. If anyone has a complaint, forgive one another. And the word usage that Paul uses here, forgive one another, it really echoes Matthew chapter 18, Jesus' parable of the unforgiving servant. That we must forgive. We must forgive each other because Christ has forgiven us. God has forgiven us, so we need to forgive. Paul understood the danger of unforgiveness. Bear with one another. If there's any complaints, forgive and put on love. I want to define love because love is used so much within our culture. I can say I love chicken. I do. I'm a preacher. Plus, I'm from Eastern Kentucky. We love chicken. I can say I love my wife. I love my little girl, Grace. I love this church. We use that word love a lot. So what does love mean? What does Paul mean here when he says put on love? He would define love as patient. Love is kind. It is not envious. It's not boast. It's not self-seeking. It's not rude. It's not easily angered. He sets this definition out for us in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We use it a lot in weddings and other places, and I think it fits there as well. But it's a love that we're to have for each other, and Jesus would even say our enemies. You see, because in our culture, in our world, it's easy for us to fall in love, to fall out of love. One day I'll love you, one day I won't. But that's not the type of love that Paul is mentioning here. Love is not a feeling. It's not an emotion. Love is what I do. It's how I care for you. There's times that I know Nellie probably doesn't like me very well. But she loves me. Those days that I just really irritate her. Not on her good side, but I know she loves me. There may be some times that you don't like me, but I hope you love me. That doesn't change. Our love for one another, putting on that love, should not change with circumstances. Because it's what we do. And what's the outcome of all of this? The outcome of putting on love, of remembering who we are, of bearing with one another, the outcome of it is peace. The peace that Christ wants to give. I think each of us wants a little bit of peace. Safe haven. A home. People that we can rely on. That we know loves us. When everything else is falling apart, we have one another. But how do we achieve this? How is this even possible? It's easy for me to get up and just say, hey, love one another. Do this, do that. But how? Paul goes on and says, by letting the word dwell in you. Verse 16, he says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing songs and hymns and spiritual songs with thanksgiving in your heart to God. You see, our strength to bear with one another, to love one another, to build this unity, even when it's difficult. The strength doesn't come from within. The strength comes from Him. The constant dwelling on His Word. Remembering who we are. You see, if we continue to dwell on His Word, that would change the way that we think. And as we said, if we change the way that we think, we'll change the way that we act. Our strength doesn't come from within, it comes from with Him. That's why Paul goes on and says, by doing everything in the name of Jesus. In verse 17 he says, and whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. Now for them, when they say, do everything in the name of, it's got two ideas to it. The first idea is a representation. Everything that we do, hopefully we can do as God's representatives. We want to be His hands. We want to be His feet. We want to do the things that He would do. Because ultimately, we represent Him to an outside world. We are His ambassadors. But it also has the idea of being empowered by. Everything that you do in word and deed, do it empowered by Lord Jesus Christ. You see, we're to put off the old self. The old life. We're to put it to death. We're to put on love, compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, not just with one another, but with the world. And that doesn't come easy. That doesn't come natural. I can't do that on my own. I need help. I need strength. I need to be empowered by someone who's stronger than myself. So everything that we do in word and deed, let's do it in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Let us remember who we are. Let us remember what He has done for us. Remember how we can put off the old self and to put on the new. Remembering His sacrifice. Remembering His love. Remembering that the fact that the wrath of God was placed on Him for us. What we deserve. Let us put off the old self. If that's what you want to do, come now as we stand.